here's your host of Living the Country Life, Betsy Freeze.
Whether you have 4 or 40 acres, native plants are a great choice for landscaping. Today we have Scott Peterson with us. Scott's a natural resource biologist. We're going to talk about native plants. Where are we right now, Scott?
Well, currently we're standing in a restoration of a prairie, and essentially about 10 years ago this used to be an ag field, and rather than growing what Iowa's known for now as the corn and beans, we're now growing what historically would have been here, the tall grass prairie. So what we've done is we put in native grasses and forbs to replace those corn and beans.
And what are some of the native plants that we see here?
The plant you have in your hand right now is big blue stem. We've also got some cytosgrama, we've got little blue stem, we've got some Indian grass, and we've got about 10 or 12 varieties of forbs out in this seeding.
All right. And when you go to restore your land to put in these native plants, what does that take?
Essentially what you have to do is start with a clean slate. We had a soybean field, and when we got done harvesting the soybeans, we essentially disced up the stubble, we then packed it, and then we went over it with a broadcast native grass planter. And essentially what that does is just spread the seed over the ground, and then we went back over with a packer again to get that good soil contact with the seed. A lot of problems some people have essentially early on when they're doing native grasses and forbs is they plant them too deep.
And how deep would too deep be?
You definitely don't want to plant your grasses or forbs deeper than a ½ inch. A lot of the experts recommend a 1/4 inch or less.
And where would I get the seed to plant?
There's a number of private growers throughout the state that a person can get to, and you could essentially search the web or go talk to some of your conservation specialists and such and give you some lists.
And how do I know what to choose for my area?
A lot of that depends on your site. The site might be a dry site, it might be a wet site, you might be close to some wooded areas where you could take advantage of some more of the woodland species. So essentially know your soils.
I've heard that native plants can be weedy at first. Is that normal?
That's going to be very normal. In fact, people, when they do start a prairie, they need to be very patient with it. The first year or two, you're going to be fighting a lot of the seeds that have been in the soil now for a while, such as your annual broadleaves, your foxtails, some of your grasses. And what you're going to do is you're going to fight those seeds for a couple years until your native grasses and forbs take hold. The best way to do that is by mowing it periodically the first year, maybe even the second.
Are there some plants that I really don't want to put in here in the mix?
Well, that's a good question, and that's something that we're still learning early on. Even some of the native plants that we've put in ours, such as some of these sunflower seeds,
right,
native seeds, we have learned can be very competitive in an early seeding. So we've kind of backed off on some of those. As I mentioned, we also don't want to go real heavy on the tall grasses. And we're finding out that early on, some of the seed comes up and takes over your planting, but as the prairie matures, those seeds start backing off and you start getting other ones also.
What are some of the invasive species that we really want to avoid?
Well, we have some invasives right here in this field over here if you want to follow me.
All right, great.
Here's an example of invasive species that we have coming out in the prairie. This is a shrub, and you can see around there's a bunch of little clump of shrubs that are starting to come in. And these are in types of invasive species that we want to try and get rid of. Another good example, it would be a noxious weed, which would be the types of thistles that we have, the bull thistle, the musk thistle, Canada thistle. These two are something that you want to try and take hold of early on in your seeding. Essentially, after the first year of seeding, when they start coming up, I would do some mowing on them, maybe 2 or 3 times. You allow your warm season grasses, which essentially start really growing later in the year, to overtake them. You may not completely get rid of the thistle, but you'll at least be able to suppress them enough that they won't be really competitive and take over your area. Another good way of suppressing not only the thistle but also the shrubs is to do some burns. About every 4 to 7 years you may want to put a burn through the area, not only to keep the trees and shrubs out, but also gets rid of some of the thatch and the duff layer on the ground and just actually rejuvenates all of the prairie plants again.
Burning seems kind of dangerous. Is there a way to do that safely?
Anytime you put a match on the ground, it's probably not a safe thing. So what we really recommend to landowners to really research, find out about your area. If it's a smaller plot and you're out in the open, it's probably not as dangerous. If you're in the city, I definitely would not recommend burning, and maybe mowing would be the best alternative. But there is some experts around. Besides talking to the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the local county conservation boards have people on staff too that can maybe advise you on that burning part.
Thank you, Scott. That's very informative. I learned a lot about native plants, and I'm ready to go out and plant my prairie.